Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Highland Park Public Library, we'd like to welcome you to Library in Your Living Room. We are pleased to present Shelf Isolation, a weekly mini-series about books, culture, and what to read next. I'm Sarah Marie, and this is your Information and Reader Services Department. In this episode, we are excited to share with you what we have been reading, watching, and/or listening to during Shelf Isolation. To begin our mini-series, I'm going to turn things over to Readers Roundtable expert and moderator, Michelle.
Thank you, Sarah Marie. This week, I started by reading Fragility by Robyn DiAngelo. I know we've talked about this before, so I'll be very brief. So it is a book about exploring the counterproductive reactions white people have when their assumptions about race are challenged and how these reactions maintain racial inequality. This was a really great book. It's another book in my ongoing journey to be anti-racist. It's a wonderful one. So if you're looking for a book by a white person for white people about racism, this is a really great book. Next, I read a book called The Art of Theft by Sherry Thomas. It is the fourth book in the Ladies Sherlock series, which is a reimagining of the Sherlock Holmes story featuring a woman named Charlotte Holmes, who is a society outcast with a brilliant mind. And she comes up with the persona of Sherlock Holmes with the help of her friend and benefactor, Mrs. Watson. In The Art of Theft, they get a request from an old friend of Mrs. Watson's to help them locate secret letters in a famous painting that is for sale at a very highly attended art sale. The series is very fun. It's a really great series. And the first book in the series is called The Study of Scarlet Women. And that's actually all I've been reading this week. So I'm going to hand it off to Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle. I had kind of a short week of reading too. I did read an interesting biography. It's called Good Time Party Girl, and it's the notorious life of Dirty Helen Cromwell. It was a very interesting book. Helen was born in Cicero, Indiana, which I only knew of Cicero, Illinois. Anyway, she came from a wealthy family, but she found that she was very attracted to men early on, and she ran off with her first husband and moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was in charge of a saloon. And she went on to be like a salesperson and stuff. But in the meantime, she also found out a few hard knocks. Her husband was having an affair with a not so nice lady. So Helen kind of had a fit and destroyed the lady's apartment and also took the lady's diamond ring. In the meantime, they had had 2 children. So she decided to leave one child with her husband and took the other one and fled to Tucson, Arizona, where she met a timber baron. And so the story goes on and on. Anyway, she lived from 1889 to 1969, was married 6 times. The reason why she went by the name Dirty Helen was she said that she could outswear anyone. Well, she did a lot more than swearing. We'll just say that throughout the book. She became a madam. But what she is really known for is she ended up settling in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she ran a place called the Sunflower Inn. It was a tavern. From 1926, she owned it until 1960. And at this place, the interesting thing is she met like Al Capone, a bunch of other gangsters. She was involved with a person who robbed a bank. Again, she was married 6 times. She was just known as being very approachable, very entertaining, very vulgar language and things. But she had this Sunflower Inn, and the interesting thing about it was it had like no like bar stools or anything. People would be lounging on the floor and stuff. There would be a piano playing in the background, and it would just be packed. Anyone and everyone in Milwaukee went to this place. She ended up having varicose veins, and that was her downfall, not all the other things. And she had surgery, and while she was having surgery, she took out a loan, ended up losing the Sunflower Inn. So she ends up kind of a sad death, not such a great person. She kind of not only became Dirty Helen, but she kind of lived on the streets Helen. Anyway, it was very much like reading about a train wreck, and I wasn't quite sure, how factual the things are because it's Helen telling the story to a ghostwriter. And so I looked up some things at the end because she talked about how much she loved her sons and things. Well, she kind of liked herself more than her children. So there were things like she basically kidnapped the one son, Donnie, that she took with her to Arizona. So then her first husband ended up taking her to court, getting custody of her. But very good, interesting book. I'm not quite sure what the attraction was about her because men loved her and stuff. But looking at these pictures, I can't figure it out. So I tried to find some younger pictures and things, and they're just like older pictures of her. And I mean, and at the end, she was kind of like just a toothless, looked like a bag lady. So I would recommend it. I know that doesn't sound so great, but again, it's The Good Time Party Girl, and it was just reissued. It was first written in 1969. It has some information in the back about what is factual in the book and some stories. And then one other thing, her family in Ohio actually has a paper company called Dirty Helen's, and they do invitations and things, and they based it upon her, even though they never met her. So with that, I'm sure Gus has a great follow-up to my story, so I'm handing it over to Gus.
You know I always do, Stephanie. First off, I'm doing this from the car because that's how dedicated I am to shelf isolation. But it's my oldest daughter's birthday. So turning, how old are you turning?
9.
I don't know if you guys can hear that on my AirPods. She's 9 years old. So just wanted to start off with that. So lately I have read a trilogy that I highly, highly recommend. It's the Wayward Pines trilogy by Blake Crouch. It came out in 2012, and I think he ended the series in 14, 15, and it was also made into a TV show. It's one of those books with Blake Crouch. I don't know if anybody's read him, but he is a sci-fi author, and this was recommended to me, and it is about, without ruining anything, because whatever you think is going to happen, you have you're just, don't read anything about it. Just read the book like I did. I kind of went into it blind. But it's about a federal agent. His name is Ethan Burke. He goes to the appearance of his 2 colleagues in a town called, you guessed it, Wayward Pines, Idaho. So he wakes up and he has an enormous headache. He can't even remember his name. He just wakes up. He doesn't know what the heck is going on, and what flows that is pretty. So I would highlight the series, all 3 books, and they're about 350 pages. I read them in I want to say 3 days or something like that. I couldn't stop reading it. I had to find out what happened, and I have not watched the show, but I want to finish the series first, and I thought it was absolutely awesome. If you guys are fans of his other work, I think you guys will. Also, this got a game that I want to recommend for the PlayStation. It is called Fallout 4. It came out 5 years ago. I know, but the games are very cheap in dollars at $5 below. So check it out. It is a series. It's like a post-it series. It takes, I think, like 2370 or something like that. And it's a first person. And if you've played the other games, I think this takes like 10 years after Fallout 3. And I'm excited to play it. I'm more excited. It was $5. So with that, I am going to leave it to Nancy.
Okay, thank you, Gus, and happy birthday, Sophia. So I'm going to share my screen here, as usual. Not surprisingly, we're talking a little bit about Ravinia here. Now, in addition to being a cultural touchstone, and also the home, it's the summer home of Chicago Symphony, and it used to be a beautiful place for opera. Ravinia has also served as a community center in a way, with having high school graduation there and having local plays. For example, this play that was put together and written by, DSHH is actually Highland Park High School's previous name, put together plays and having them in a theater. And people find these programs now digitized very interesting, also because people love the ads in here. They're kind of funny. So, and in this case, this particular program, which is on the Illinois Digital Archives, but I don't believe published yet, but all the information about the plays actually kind of squeeze between these ads for local institutions and local stores, which people research frequently. So it kind of shows the role that Ravinia was just not a place where the Chicago Symphony came to play and opera singers and all kinds of fun things. It also was a place for the community to have their local presentations and for their local entertainment center. And with that, I am going to hand this off to Karen, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. I just have two books to talk about today. And one is one I've mentioned in the past. It's called The Terracotta Dog by Andrea Camilleri. It's part of a long series of Italian mysteries. And first of all, I have to say that as much as we like to recommend books to people, this was something that one of my patrons recommended to me, this series. And that's how I came to know of it at all. But I'm finished with The Terracotta Dog, and it begins, I was a little disappointed. I wasn't sure I was going to stick with it because it begins with a very complicated story of a heist from a grocery store and a mafioso, and I just couldn't keep it straight, and I almost gave up. But about halfway through, when they're investigating this heist, they find a bunch of crates in this hidden cave, in the cliff wall or something. And the inspector, the main character, is curious about one wall of the cave, which doesn't look quite as though it fits in. And sure enough, it's been bricked up. There's another cave beyond the first cave, and there are two dead bodies in there that have been there for about 50 years. And the stranger thing, maybe, is that it looks as though there's been a scene set up. There's a terracotta dog statue and a pitcher and a bowl of old coins. And the rest of the book is all about finding out who these people are and what's the meaning of the setting and how did this all happen. So I am, this is unusual for me. I'm motivated to go back and reread a good half of the book so I can find out how this all happened, how the author put this all together for this pretty much a surprise ending, but a very, much more interesting plot than a grocery store theft. So, and the next one is a book called Lateral Cooking, which I want to show you because it's kind of unusual looking, very large for a cookbook, and almost no illustrations at all. It looks a lot like a textbook, in fact, in some cases, some of these spreads. This is a typical recipe, no photographs, nothing, nothing it would seem to encourage you, but actually it's a book about first of all, the author is Nikki Segnet. She's a British food writer. This is her second book. She spent about 8 years on it. Her first book was called The Flavor Thesaurus, and in Lateral Cooking, which is subtitled One Dish Leads to Another, she is kind of discovering the relationships between various recipes, like does a cookie recipe lead to a pancake recipe and then to a cake recipe with subtle changes? And she wants to be able to not have to rely on recipes, which is what she's done. And she knows her grandmother has not, but she just wants to develop this sense that you can instinctively, start with one thing that has worked for you and change it a little bit, end up with something completely different. So I know it would be impossible for you to see this, but let's say a typical recipe is on a 2-page spread, and there is like a chunk of orange type on the right-hand side, which is A, B, C, D, and on, of hints about substitutions and what might happen if you do this, and suggestions. And besides being an interesting cookbook, it's got all kinds of stories of her travels and her experiences with food all over the world. And I think it would be a good desert island cookbook. You could just sit and read it and not have to worry about cooking anything and still enjoy it. So that's my second one for this week. And we will move on now to Jackie.
Thank you very much, Karen. So this week I read 1.5 books. The first one is called 8 Perfect Murders by Peter Swanson. And this is about Malcolm Kershaw, who is a co-owner and manager of the Old Devil's bookstore in Boston. This is a bookstore that's basically a mystery bookstore, and they sell new and used books. He is contacted by an FBI agent, Gwen Mulvey, who is looking into a series of unsolved murders that seem to point to a blog post he wrote back in 2004, his very first blog post for the Old Devil's bookstore. And it was entitled 8 Perfect Murders, which were fiction's most unsolvable murders. So she has come to him asking for his help and advice, since he seems to be an expert on these murders. But there's also a question of, is he maybe a suspect? So it's a very fast-paced book. The one thing I will say is, if you haven't read some of the classic murder mystery books, you may want to skip this book because there are some spoiler alerts in the book. But it's a very good book. It's read very fast, and I really enjoyed it. So if you like mystery, try that one. The other book I'm about halfway through for is called Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Payne. And the book is about two families, Frances Gleason, who married Lena, and Brian Fanhope, who married Anne. Frances and Brian are New York City police officers. They met in the police academy back in 1973, and they both ended up in the suburban town of Gillen. Frances and Lena's youngest daughter, Kate, and Brian and Anne's son, Peter, have this massive friendship. They became friends when they were very little, and they just have a very fast friendship. So as they grew, they became very close. The parents are not real close to each other. And when they turned about 13, they were getting ready to graduate from 8th grade. About 3 weeks before that graduation ceremony, an event happened that separated Peter and Kate. It reverberates with both families, and it's a very interesting book. It has a lot of points of view that's told, the story told through, and it really is interesting. Now, I've only read about halfway, so I've gotten up to the point when Peter and Kate are graduating from high school, so I'm really looking forward to finding out the end of the book. And I know a lot of people read this book, and it's very, very popular, and book groups have been using it. So I would say, you know, if you want a good book, Ask Again Yes would be it. The other thing I did this weekend, everybody who has Disney Plus, watched Hamilton, which I wanted to see the play, but due to events in my life, I was not able to see it. And it is a wonderful, wonderful version of the musical. So, you know, if you've got Disney Plus, you've got to watch it. If you don't, find somebody who has Disney Plus so you can watch it. So that's my self-isolation thing for this week, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Jackie, and I absolutely second the Hamilton recommendation. I have seen it live, and I think it was better filmed. But yes, Hamilton is amazing, and I definitely recommend it. And hopefully at some point it will be on DVD, and then we can have it in the library collection. The soundtrack is on Hoopla if you want to listen to the soundtrack. So anyway, for recommendations, first I have 2 recommendations from my 21-month-old, which is all different animal sounds. Lots of fun to read because you get to make lots of animal sounds. And then this one I just found, which is more interesting, is The Wheels on the Tooktook. So it's a little bus in India. And so you get to sing about things like sipping chai and eating papadums. So this one's very cute too. And one nice thing, it has a glossary at the back that explains what everything is, including like the first time I read through thought it was tuk-tuk, and it is Tooktook. So, The Wheels on the Tooktook. And then my books for this week. First, I read The Secrets That We Kept by Laura Prescott, which is a historical novel set during the Cold War about spies in the CIA who helped to get Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago manuscript out of Russia and then publish it and sneak copies back in so that the Soviet people would be able to read it. Super interesting, a pretty quick read for being like a serious historical novel, and I really enjoyed it. Would be a great pick for anybody who's interested in espionage. My second book this week was Codename Helen by Ariel Lawhon. This is World War II historical fiction, which I know was very popular in Highland Park. This is based on the true story of a woman named Nancy Wake, who's an Australian journalist who is living in France and married a French man. And she begins working to help people escape from France when France is occupied by Germany, and then eventually ends up working for the French resistance. And the novel begins as she's parachuting back into France. She had been in England, so we don't really know like why she was in England or any of that. And so it goes back and forth between 2 storylines, one where she's helping the French resistance, and then one starting about 10 years before the war leading up to that point. And this one, I mostly listened to an audio and kind of switched back and forth. I happen to have the advanced reader copy and really enjoyed this one. Definitely recommend it if you're looking for World War II historical fiction. And then finally, on a lighter note, I read The Honey Don't List by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren is actually 2 authors writing together. That's their pen name. And all of their books are romantic comedy. And this one is about the assistants of a family that is on HGTV. They're clearly meant to be Chip and Joanna Gaines. Their company is called Comb and Honey, like Hearth and Hand. But the couple that is on this Netflix show is not their marriage is not doing so well. And so these two assistants are stuck together trying to keep this couple from like killing each other essentially on their tour. So it's a lot of fun and a quick read, and I enjoyed it, and I will pass it on to Sarah Marie.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So I drove about 1,400 miles this past weekend and spent a lot of time listening to podcasts and audiobooks. So I started with a book published in January of this year, 2020, called Friendship: The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond by Lydia Denworth. Denworth has done extensive research on the subject of friendship, mostly because it's of particular interest to her, but also because it is a relatively little studied part of human psychology and the psyche. It has, however, been studied, and Denworth weaves together past and present field biology, neuroscience, and a lot of anecdotal evidence to show how our bodies and minds are designed to make friends, the process by which social bonds develop, and how a drive for friendship underpins society as a whole. And it is fascinating. If you have interest in the subject, I recommend both the book and the audiobook, but it reads very, very technical at times, and I could not actually listen to it my entire drive. Happily, it reminded me of another book, so I picked that back up and restarted listening to Text Me When You Get Home: The Evolution and Triumph of Modern Female Friendship by Kaeleen Schaffer, which is immensely accessible and is a mix of historical research, the author's own personal experience, and conversations about friendship across the country. As the title suggests, Schaffer did not focus on just modern examples of female friendship, but went back to female friendship as described in source materials from the Middle Ages up to the modern era. Schaffer delves into depictions of female friendships in popular culture, societal concepts such as the Mean Girls tropes, narrative of female friendships being stand-ins until romantic ties are created, and so on and so forth. What originally interested me in this novel, beyond the fact that it was recommended to me by a friend, was the title. The title is a phrase that I constantly tell my own friends, however they identify, and Schaffer unpicks it, society and friendship, with all a deft hand, which also amped me up for this upcoming novel written by two hosts of one of my Comfort Listen podcasts that talk about friendship. So Aminatu So and Anne Friedman are the hosts of the Collier Girlfriend podcast, which is a podcast for long-distance besties everywhere. So since launching in 2014, they've evolved from weekly discussions on headline topics as well as personal discussions, and they now include author interviews as well as person of interest interviews. So a little bit about the two of them. Aminatu was named one of Forbes 30 Under 30 in tech, and Anne herself is a journalist and contributes to New York Magazine, Los Angeles Times, and The Gentlewoman. So their discussions they're interesting, but they're also very prescient, and so they also give me a lot of food for thought. So based off their friendship and podcast success, they have written a book that will come out next Tuesday on the 14th of July. The book is called Big Friendship: How We Keep Each Other Close. So one of the main talking points and truths both women have reported is that a close friendship is one of the most influential and important relationships a human life can contain. So in their book, they detail how they both struggled for years to juggle what David Sedaris calls the four burners: family, friends, health, and work. So in the novel, Aminatu and Anne both delve psychologically and emotionally into the nature and concept of a big friendship, whether it's a long-distance relationship like their own, or anyone deemed appropriate to include in one's chosen family. And I am, again, terribly excited for this book's publication. Friendship and societal connections have really been kind of an underpinning to keep so many of us together during these past few months, so I'm excited to learn more about it on a large scale and hear about these particular two authors on a minor scale. And now I will move things on to Catherine.
Thanks, Sarah Marie. The first book I'm going to recommend this week is called Barn 8 by Deb Olin Unferth. It's a book about a chicken heist. It starts with teenager Janie Flores, who runs away from her mother in New York City to find her father, whom she just learned exists. He's in Iowa. It turns out that he works in Big Ag, and eventually Janie, over the course of several years, ends up working in Big Ag as well. She works as an auditor for a chicken farm. As things progress, she eventually becomes involved in / helps instigate a kind of ridiculous plot to remove a massive number of chickens from a particular chicken farm. By this point, we have more characters that I won't, for the sake of time, explain all of them to you, but there is a minor character whose name is Walk, just to give you a hint. So I really like this book. The characters are great, it's funny, and it touches on climate fiction, or cli-fi as it's sometimes called, but overall it's just a fun book. The next book I'm going to talk about is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb, which got a fair amount of press. A therapist talks about her patients, who I assume are pretty actually well-disguised composites or something like that, and also her own experience in therapy, which she started after a bad breakup. But it's a light read because it's about successful therapy, and it's really easy to get interested in the characters. So I think this is a good summer read if you're looking for something that's not totally fluffy, but at the same time is just engrossing and interesting, but it doesn't require too much of the reader. And then lastly, I want to mention the Decameron Project. The New York Times Magazine just launched this. They invited 29 authors to write short stories about the pandemic. So far, I've only had time to read the one by Karen Russell. I started with her because I love her the most. But I'm really looking forward to the other authors. It includes Tommy Orange, Edwidge Danticat, Charles Yu, Rachel Kushner, Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, and however many more until you get to 29, but a lot of huge name authors. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. And with that, I will pass it on to William's always excellent recommendations.
Thank you, Catherine. I feel a little bit of pressure now, but that's all right. Have at it. So this past weekend saw me taking a trip down memory lane to rewatch Revolutionary Girl Utena. This is an anime series from 1997 that centers around Utena Tenju, a young woman inspired by a chance encounter to become a prince who finds herself fighting sword duels against her school student council to win the hand of classmate / Rose Bride, Auntie Himamiya, who shares an unknown connection to the end of the world. If you're a fan of things like Steven Universe or the latest iteration of She-Ra and the Princesses of Powers, this is a great series to take a look at, as the creators of both of those cite Revolutionary Girl Utena as a formative piece of media that they had growing up that inspired them to the series they did. Now, the library does own the entire series on DVD, and it's available for you to check out. But if you cannot wait, there's actually a legal stream of this that can be found on YouTube, and the link will be in the doobly-doo down below. And for anyone who's picky, yes, there's both dubbed and subbed versions of the show. I also went back to my backlog of games and picked up Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, which is available from the library on the PS4 and the Xbox One. It represents the attempt to blend probably the most popular intellectual property on the planet with the most punishing genre of video games currently popular in the AAA sphere, the Soulsborne style. For those who aren't familiar, the Soulsborne games speak to a specific set of design principles in action RPGs that emphasize precision and achieving success through the knowledge of repeated failure. Some of the games in this lineage include Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and Nioh, all of which, with the exception of Demon Souls, you can get from the library. Because this is being done with this very valuable IP, you'll notice that the game is not as punishing as it could be. There's actually a difficulty selection process if you're really just more interested in the story than duking it out with stormtroopers who can probably one-shot you. That leads to some of the crispness not being where it could be, but in these other games, you don't get to have a dual-bladed lightsaber and hang out with Saw Gerrera, the best part of Rogue One Don't At Me, as voiced by Forrest Whitaker. So, give and take. The worlds are also very dense, doing a more Metroid style, making areas inaccessible that you get to later based on expanding your force abilities. It's, I think, a pretty solid time, and it's a nice way to spend this fallow period in the gaming sphere until the fall winter brings some actual quality AAA experiences. And with that, I will pass it on to Lori.
Thanks, William, for those Always excellent, as usual, recommendations. This past week, I've been listening to Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. His Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. This book actually came out in 1995, and he has done a new edition, an updated edition. He took a bunch of American history, high school American history textbooks, and he compared them, and he analyzed how they present American history and found it incredibly wanting, just really bad. Talks about how so many historic figures are heroified to the point where they're totally bland. He talks about Helen Keller, for example, who everyone seems to know her for being deaf and blind. But actually she was quite really involved in social reform, the settlement movement and the union movement and things like that. And actually she was a socialist, which I did not know. But they don't talk about that in history books because, socialism. Or he talks about Woodrow Wilson, Christopher Columbus, who are held up as paragons in many history books and were actually not really nice people. And also he talks a lot about how these American history books are so deadly dull that they make students dislike history, when in fact it is the kind of thing that if you bring in, like first person archival narrative and things like that, you can really become alive, kind of like Stephanie mentioned from her book, these fascinating characters who are part of, all sorts of historical things. And it can also make us better citizens by understanding what drove certain movements in American history. So it's quite a good book. It's very thought-provoking. I'm listening to it, and the narrator is also very good, and I highly recommend it. The only other thing I have to recommend this week is Eurovision Song Contest, The Story of Fire Saga, which is on Netflix, and it is a Will Ferrell movie about Eurovision. Eurovision is a real thing. It has been around for like over 50 years, and it's a European song contest where different countries, singers, performers from different countries represent their country in these elaborate songs. ABBA won, and that kind of starts this whole movie. The Will Ferrell and Rachel McAdams characters grow up wanting, it's their lifelong thing to represent Iceland in Eurovision. And it was really funny. I do have to admit that some of the, the song sequences I skipped through because it was like, okay, I get it. They're over the top. But it was funny. I highly recommend it, especially if you have a headache and can't sleep, because I had a headache when I couldn't sleep, watched it, and when it was over, I'd laughed so much my headache was gone. And that's all I have. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah Marie.
That's it for us today, folks. As always, please remember that we are all here for you. We are available for any comments, questions, or concerns that you may have, and you can reach us online through Facebook at facebook.com/HPLibrary, through our Twitter, which is @HPLibrary, or via email, which is hppla@hplibrary.org. You can find this information online through our website, which is hplibrary.org. Our music today was Carefree by Clevin McLeod. You can find more information about this and the titles mentioned in the show notes below. Okay, everybody, this is us signing off. Until we see you next, stay safe.